Hello and welcome again. It's Chris Fleming from the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at the University of Western Sydney, and this is the wrap-up of week 5 in Philosophy and the Good Life, which was really an orientation to Hellenistic philosophy. Now, what we did in week 5 was give some kind of historical and cultural context to the kinds of thinkers that we'll be looking at for the next 3 weeks. So Hellenistic period in historical terms really stretches from the 1st century before the Common Era to the 3rd century of the Common Era, or what we used to call BC and AD. These conventions shift occasionally, but for those of you who might be familiar with one form of historical, terminology and others another form. In any case, that's roughly the historical period that we're talking with. Now, this is a period of immense cultural change. One of the changes that is occurring at this time in the area, in the areas of the Mediterranean and what we now think of as Europe and Asia Minor, which is Turkey, the Middle East, and so on, and North Africa, is that there is a shift in empires. In the 1st century, Greece really loses control of its own empire, and the Romans inherit that empire and implement their own series of changes to this. But this is a world in great transition. For instance, it could be illustrated any number of ways. But one of the things one might note is the variety of languages spoken at this time. So, for instance, in week 6, we look at the thought of Marcus Aurelius. Now, he wrote in Koine Greek. Koine Greek is a little different from other forms of ancient Greek. Koine Greek is really just everyday Greek at the time. It's not everyday Greek now. It's very different from modern Greek, but it's just the everyday language of the people of the street who are speaking Greek. Then you later have thinkers that are writing in Latin. So there's a lot of transition going on, and I went through some of the pressures that the society or the empire was going through. And one of these was a kind of shift towards more aggressively imperial values. So away from certain conceptions, even conceptions of the good life, but certainly democracy. And the empire aggressively starts to try to take over the region, create this. It's Alexander the Great's dream to create a pan-Hellenic world. That is, the whole world could be Greek in a particular way. Now, Rome is having mixed success with its mission in this inherited empire and imposing itself for a whole number of reasons. But one is that there's enormous amount of strain on materials. I mean, in order to carry out an empire and execute those kind of plans, the amount of slaves you need, the military presence you need, and so on. The other thing is that there is a pervasive sense of cultural unease that is starting to set in this period. It's not that cultural unease is not there before, but it's particularly acute for a whole range of reasons. There are intermingling of cultures and customs. People feel disoriented. There are concentrations of populations around cities, and there is the same sense that often people have now. We are losing old ways of life. Even these days we have a romantic attitude towards the country. When times were simpler, and it's similar, not identical, but a similar thing is happening in the ancient world, in ancient Rome, in this inherited empire. Now, that is just like these days, in times past, there are responses to this. I was saying that in some ways there are parallels, although we've got to be careful with the parallels between the Roman Empire in this state of tumult and contemporary America. Now, America is not an empire in any straightforward sense, but there are similar, we were talking about in the seminar, there are some similar features in a way. And in the US, the sense of unease is often one of the responses to this is these kind of personalities that you see coming out in the media. Oprah, Dr. Phil, who will address these concerns and this desire for people to know, how am I going to live in this complicated world that we're now inhabiting? And not just how am I going to live in how am I going to be happy in a psychological sense, but how am I going to live? And that has moral overtones, I guess, and most clearly seen in people like Laura Schlesinger or what's the name, Judge Judy, who will stand there and tell people that they're living bad lives, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying these are good, these are not good examples of what we'd think of as moral psychological instruction, but they are certainly responses to a sense of what sociologists call anomie, or a sense of unease. Well, the same thing's happening in the ancient world around this period, and the response is philosophical. And there are four main schools of thought. There are minor schools of thought: cynicism, skepticism, Pythagoreanism is still around. But the four main schools of thought are Aristotle's school, which we've covered, Plato's school, which we've also covered, and the Stoics and the Epicureans. Now, we'll be looking at the Stoics for the next few weeks, but we did touch on Epicurean philosophy. Now, Epicurus held that the good life was a life that was based around happiness or pleasure, more straightforwardly pleasure. So it's similar in some ways to more modern conceptions of what a good life is. It's about having a good time. Now, there's an important qualification to that. Epicurus didn't mean by this that you kind of drink yourself stupid and do whatever you want. Well, if that was going to bring you happiness, you would do that, Epicurus thought. But the fact is that Epicurus believed that people were not very good at figuring out what brought them pleasure. They were very easily misled and did things that caused them great displeasure when they thought, they were expecting the opposite. Now, what he thought that you did need for a good life was, there were three ingredients. One was freedom. So freedom from domination by a boss or an overseer, or you were beholden in some way to someone, in an economic tie, really. The second feature of the good life was friendship. He valued very greatly the role of friends in the good life, and in fact lived. His school had people living together as a result of this particular conception. And the third was a rational approach to one's problems, that one spends time thinking about problems in life. And what he means by that is not just kind of sitting around ruminating and obsessing over things, but rather bracketing one's concerns, putting them aside and saying, I'm going to deal with these things later on. That's certainly one of the interpretations that we could put to Epicurus's philosophy. In any case, it was really just to give you a sense of the kind of thinking that was going on. Now, Epicurus did think about metaphysical issues, but really what we see with these Hellenistic thinkers is they are definitely not as interested in metaphysical questions about physical reality and so on. They really are looking really at questions of the good life. This is one of the reasons that Hellenistic philosophers have been often overlooked in histories of philosophy. In any case, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to take an in-depth look at one of the Hellenistic schools, Stoicism. In fact, Stoicism was one of these major schools that was established by the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 176 AD, I think, or in the Common Era. And so Stoicism is one of these main schools. In fact, Marcus Aurelius himself was a Stoic philosopher, albeit influenced by other schools. So we'll be looking at Marcus Aurelius's Meditations in week 6, and we will be concentrating on the Stoics before we turn our attention to different themes, concrete themes that have arisen so far in the unit. But for the next 3 weeks, after our orientation to the Hellenistic world, we'll now be looking at some Hellenistic thinkers in detail. That is, we're going to slow down for a moment and spend some time with 3 thinkers, and they are Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. And so hopefully you'll get something out of it. But let's see. I'll see you in the seminars, and take care until then.